Recent events have shown us how much a few days can change things in the Middle East. Just 19 days in 1973 saw a massive conflict between Israel, Egypt, Syria, and a scattering of Arab allies that still shape the region to this day. The Yom Kippur War, as the Israelis call it, also known as the October War, the Ramadan War, or the Fourth Arab-Israeli War, saw both sides endure devastating defeats and miraculous victories in one of the bloodiest chapters in the history of the modern Middle East. Today, on A Day in History, we look at how Egypt and Syria launched a sudden invasion that ended up with Israeli troops threatening both their capital cities and reshaping the landscape of Middle Eastern politics. If you appreciate videos about challenging topics like this, consider leaving a like and subscribing for more engaging videos like this one. The immediate root of the war was Israel's success in the Six-Day War of 1967. Israel had fended off a coalition of Arab states and massively expanded its own territory, taking control of the Golan Heights from Syria, the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and both the Gaza Strip and Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. The conflict only hardened existing animosity between Israel and the Arab states, and led a coalition of countries, including Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and Iraq, to declare the three no's in their dealings with Israel: no permanent peace, no recognition of Israel's legitimacy, and no negotiations with its government. Egypt, who had lost the most territory to Israel, continued to engage in skirmishes along the border throughout the late 1960s, until President Anwar Sadat agreed to a ceasefire in 1970. Sadat's government signaled its willingness to break the three no's by recognizing the State of Israel in exchange for them returning the Sinai Peninsula and other Arab territories. But Israel turned down the terms. Sadat's concerns were shared by his Syrian counterpart, Hafez al-Assad, who made recovery of the Golan Heights a top foreign policy priority. Under the guise of diplomatic summits, Assad and Sadat began planning an attack on Israel, and both ramped up military training and recruitment. As always, the Cold War loomed in the background. The United States backed Israel and feared that rising Arab power would increase Soviet influence in the region. Meanwhile, Egypt and Syria were in the Soviet orbit, although not nearly as closely tied to it as Israel was to its own superpower ally. Both Moscow and Washington were in a period of thawing relations after the brinkmanship of the 1960s, and neither superpower was eager to see war break out in the region again. However, that did not prevent either superpower funneling arms, armor, and aircraft into their respective allies in anticipation of a potential conflict. By early 1973, Sadat had given up on hopes of negotiation and was preparing to invade. Through spring and summer of 1973, Egypt used military exercises as a cover to station its troops into attack positions along the border. These exercises successfully fooled Israeli intelligence. Much attention has been paid to Israel's actions in the lead-up to the war. Mossad intelligence noted this unprecedented buildup of military resources, but their concerns were not taken up by the government. In late September, King Hussein of Jordan even visited Prime Minister Golda Meir and warned her that he believed Syria and Egypt were preparing to invade. It was only in the early hours of October 6th, with Egypt and Syria mere hours away from attacking, that Israeli high command finally accepted that war was imminent and began calling up the reserves. One Israeli official commented that there was a delusional belief that the Arab nations would not dare to attack Israel after their embarrassment in the Six-Day War. By the daytime of October 6th, Prime Minister Meir was being presented with plans for preemptive strikes on Egyptian and Syrian positions, but she feared that preemptive attacks would lose any sympathy from the international community. They called on Washington to urge the Soviets to restrain their Arab allies, and reached out to other regional powers to call for moderation, but to no avail. At 2:05 p.m. on October 6, 1973, Egyptian and Syrian forces launched a coordinated attack against Israel on two fronts. Egyptian forces stormed across the Suez crossing into the Sinai Peninsula, while the Syrians poured over the border into the Golan Heights. This date fell on Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. The Arabs might have been hoping that the holiday would delay the Israeli response. Other analysts have argued that the lack of civilian or commercial traffic probably made it easier for Israeli military forces to maneuver in the first few hours. The Egyptian assault was named Operation Badr, and its main goal was a rapid crossing of the Suez Canal and the capture of Israel's fortified Bar-Lev line. Egypt had laid proper preparations, with surface-to-air missile sites providing cover for their assault, and logistical preparations that made transport into the war zone as easy as possible. Israel's much-touted Bar-Lev line proved completely ineffective, and the combined might of Egypt's 2nd and 3rd Field armies overcame it in less than 2 hours. Israel tried and failed to drive Egypt back over the next few days. The 8th of October saw 2 disastrous counterattacks against the Egyptian positions that cost almost 70 tanks and hundreds of soldiers' lives. However, Israel dug in over the following few days and prevented the Egyptians advancing any further, grinding the battlefront to a halt. Syria's attacks in the Golan Heights enjoyed the same success at first. The Syrian armored divisions managed to penetrate Israeli territory and captured several settlements and choke points in the region, inflicting heavy losses on Israeli armor and infantry while capturing hundreds of soldiers. Israel's situation was dire enough that on the night of October 8th, Prime Minister Meir ordered nuclear weapons to be prepared as a last resort, in case total defeat looked imminent. Syria's early victories were short-lived. By 8th of October, Israeli forces had managed to stall the momentum of the Syrian attack. The following day, Israel repelled Syrian paratrooper attacks on their lines and managed to send successful airstrikes against military targets in and around Damascus. By the 10th of October, Syria had been forced back across the Purple Line, which marked the post-1967 border. Rather than maintain the pre-war border, Israel chose to push into Syria. Syrian defenses were inadequate to repel the assault, and within a few days, Israeli artillery was able to fire on Damascus. Israel quickly established air superiority over Syria and struck power plants, bridges, and surface-to-air missile sites supporting the Syrian military. Within days, at least half of the Syrian Air Force and most of its armored vehicles had been destroyed. Israel's remarkable success in Syria prompted a wider Arab response. A patchwork of Arab forces, including 30,000 Iraqis, 2 brigades of Jordanian forces, at least 3,000 soldiers each from Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, and even an armored regiment from Morocco, joined the Syrians in attacks against the Israelis. However, even this coalition was unable to prevail. Israeli troops managed to hold their own against the surprise Arab allies, and launched guerrilla strikes to destroy bridge crossings between Syria, Iraq, and Jordan to slow the flow of reinforcements. Meanwhile, the Sinai front slowed to a stalemate, with no significant territory changes as Egypt's attacks stalled from October 10th. Both sides spent days preparing for a renewed offensive, while digging into their defensive positions. The Egyptians moved first, launching a massive armored assault on October 14th, in spite of objections to the lack of air cover raised by some top generals. Almost 1,000 Egyptian tanks smashed into the Israeli lines, and the attack utterly failed. Egypt lost over 450 armored vehicles, while Israel lost just 6. The Israelis took advantage of their victory to push west. On October 16th, Israeli forces crossed the Suez into Egypt and destroyed the anti-air defenses protecting Egyptian troops. They established a bridgehead and began moving significant amount of troops and armored resources into Suez to outflank the Egyptian armies in the Sinai. What the Egyptians had dismissed as a diversion became a full-fledged assault. Over the following days, Israeli forces spread out in the eastern areas of Egypt, putting pressure on Egyptian cities like Ismailia and Suez and pushing distressingly close to Cairo. In the face of Israel's success against its opponents, The US feared a total fragmentation of the diplomatic and economic situation in the region, while the USSR became concerned for the survival of their allies. The international community feared that the war would only escalate. Both superpowers urged a ceasefire, and the UN passed a resolution calling for one on October 22nd. The Golan Front mostly obeyed the ceasefire, and both sides halted large-scale operations there, although intermittent violence continued. However, the resolution did not calm the Sinai front. By this point, Israeli troops had completely encircled Egypt's Third Army, which was still caught on the eastern side of the Suez. The potential destruction of his army compelled Sadat to agree to a third UN call for a ceasefire on October 25th. And combined diplomatic pressure from the US and the arrival of UN forces in the region persuaded Israel to do the same. The bulk of the fighting was now over. Although fighting mostly ended, disagreements remained and negotiations were slow in the months after the war. It took until January 1974 for a formal agreement to be made between Israel and Egypt. This agreement, known as Sinai I, saw the establishment of neutral buffer zones in the Sinai as an assurance to both Israel and Egypt, and Israel ceded all territory beyond the Suez. A second agreement months later expanded the buffer zones and paved the way for more diplomatic engagement between Israel and Egypt. Official peace did not come until the Camp David Accords in 1979. Israel agreed to return the Sinai to Egypt in exchange for normalization and recognition from Egypt. This was the first official peace treaty with and diplomatic recognition of Israel by an Arab state, marking a milestone in Israeli diplomacy. It also caused Egypt to be shunned by its Arab allies for years afterwards, but it also set the stage for future Arab diplomacy with Israel in the post-Cold War world. Negotiations with Syria were similarly slow to bear fruit. Despite the ceasefire, both Israel and Syria continued to engage in skirmishing and shelling across the border, with over 1,000 reported incidents between March and May 1974 alone. The two sides reached their own agreement on disengagement in May 1974 that saw the establishment of another UN-controlled buffer zone in the Golan Heights. With the close of the war, both sides hurled various accusations of war crimes and other atrocities at each other. Israel accused Egypt of committing war crimes by attacking surrendering troops in Sinai. Supposedly, a pamphlet distributed to Egyptian soldiers from high command just before the war instructed them to kill surrendering troops. As many as 200 Israeli soldiers were executed while laying down their arms. The torture and mistreatment of POWs was another accusation against Egypt, with an Israeli report concluding that at least 86 soldiers had been unjustly killed in Egyptian captivity. One Israeli veteran recalled being captured and lined up against a wall before Egyptian soldiers opened fire. The officer told the victims that anyone who could get back up would be spared. The more intense accusations fell upon Syria. Israeli forces recapturing the Golan Heights reported finding dead soldiers and civilians killed in massacres by the Syrian army. In the village of Hushnieh, for example, 11 non-combat personnel were tied up, blindfolded, and executed by Syrian soldiers. Elsewhere, soldiers were found with their eyes gouged out, covered in bruises from beatings before death, or had their heads trampled. Victims were often found stripped of their clothes and their ID tags to make identification of the dead more difficult. POWs also spoke of torture while in Syrian captivity, including whippings and being denied food and water. Syria's brutality was no oversight, and the government celebrated it. Later, in 1974, the official Gazette of Syria reported on a medal given to one soldier who had, quote, slaughtered 28 Jewish soldiers like sheep. The medal was personally awarded by Defense Minister Mustafa Tlass. Israel was also accused of war crimes by its Arab opponents. One of the most contentious issues was the city of Quneitra. Originally a Syrian city in the Golan Heights that was captured by Israel in the 1967 war, Israel agreed to withdraw from it under the 1974 disengagement agreement. However, Israeli settlers in the city were deeply unhappy and destroyed much of the city before leaving. Key buildings and infrastructure like hospitals were stripped of anything useful, and much of the city was demolished with heavy equipment. Israel blamed the destruction on the war, but eyewitness accounts from foreign journalists confirmed that much of the damage had been done by the withdrawing Israelis. The UN formally voted to condemn Israel's behavior in Quneitra in 1975, and the city still lies in ruins to this day. Thankfully, civilian casualties in the Yom Kippur War were relatively low, and most fighting occurred far from major settlements, unlike recent altercations in the region. The war cast a shadow over Israeli politics, as the country grappled with its intelligence failures and its defeats in the opening days of the conflict. Meir was forced to resign in April 1974, in large part due to her administration's handling of the conflict, and a scathing report produced by the Agranat Commission, set up to review the war and led to the end of many high-profile government and military careers. In Egypt, the generals in charge of both the 2nd and 3rd armies, along with the military chief of staff, were fired. Syria allegedly executed some of its disgraced military commanders too. The most significant Arab response to the disaster came from Saudi Arabia, who decided to punish the US and its Western allies for supporting Israel by reducing oil production and raising prices, leading to the October 1973 global energy crisis. The oil crisis proved to be a revelation for the Arab powers, who came to realize the global economic power they could wield through their control of the precious resource. The human costs were high for such a short conflict. An estimated 2,500 Israelis were killed in action, compared to around 15,000 from the Arab coalition. Material losses were similarly skewed against the Arabs. About 100 Israeli planes were lost, compared to about 400 for the Arabs. And Israel's 400 tank losses were a fraction of the Arab losses, which amounted to well over 2,000. And stand as an example of Israeli military strength that continues to deter aggression from Arab nations. On the other hand, the diplomatic arrangement that came in its wake opened the door for more productive diplomacy between Israel and its Arab neighbors in the long run. As we've seen though, the Yom Kippur War certainly did not bring peace to the region, and it would not be the last time that Arabs and Israelis spilled each other's blood on such a massive scale in so short a time.